Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Steven Torres smelled the copper 3 miles before he found the tent. Not blood, but the pennies Madison Garcia had melted into the snow in a perfect spiral, each one stamped with a face that wasn't Lincoln's. The January wind cut through his parka as he knelt beside the spiral, counting. 47 coins, their edges fused into the ice in a pattern that looked deliberate, looked sacred. His Garmin GPS map 60 CSX put him at 6,147 feet on the Iceberg Lake Trail, 2 miles past where Madison's last known position should have been according to her emergency beacon activation 3 days ago. The spiral was fresh. He could tell by how the copper still held traces of heat, melting through the powder in perfectly symmetrical channels. Steven had been a ranger at Glacier National Park for 12 years. He'd stopped believing in coincidence after his 6th season, the year Danny Reeves had walked into the woods behind Lake McDonald and never walked out. That was 2003, 5 years ago, and Steven still carried the guilt in the space between his shoulder blades where tension gathered like storm clouds. He photographed the pennies with his digital camera, then stood and followed the boot prints leading northeast. Madison's, size 7, the tread pattern matching the Merrill Moab ventilators her emergency contact had described. But there was something wrong with the gait. The right foot dragging slightly, the left compensating with an awkward pivot, like she'd injured herself, or like something else was learning to walk in her body. Steven pushed the thought away. Hypothermia did strange things to people, made them strip naked in sub-zero temperatures, convinced their burning skin needed cooling, made them dig burrows in the snow seeking warmth in frozen earth, made them do things that looked ritualistic, but were just the brain shutting down in fractured sequences. The radio on his belt crackled. "Torres, this is base. What's your position?" He pressed the transmit button on his Motorola XPR 7552. 2 miles past Madison's beacon point. I've got tracks, following northeast toward Iceberg Lake. Copy that. Weather Service is calling for heavy snow by 1400 hours. You've got maybe 3 hours before visibility drops to 0. Steven checked his watch. 11:23 a.m. Understood. I'll update in 30. He didn't mention the pennies, didn't mention how his breath had started fogging white, even though the temperature had risen 3 degrees in the last 10 minutes according to his thermometer. Didn't mention the shapes in the tree line that looked like people standing motionless, but were just lodgepole pines casting shadows in ways shadows shouldn't fall. Danny had seen shapes too before the end. Steven had been the one to find Danny's camera, 6 months after the disappearance. The memory card corrupted, but the forensic team had recovered 3 photos, one of Danny smiling at base camp, one of the woods at sunset, and one of Danny's own face, close up, eyes wide and pupils dilated to black holes, mouth open in an expression that wasn't quite a scream. Behind him in the photo, barely visible in the grain, a figure tall enough that its head disappeared past the frame's edge. The official report called it a tragic accident. Exposure, disorientation, a fall. They'd found Danny's body 8 miles from where he'd started, curled against a boulder, frozen solid. The autopsy showed his stomach was empty except for bark and pine needles, despite the 3 days of supplies in his pack that he'd never touched. Steven forced himself back to the present. Madison Garcia, 24 years old, solo hiker from Bozeman, reported overdue by her roommate when she didn't return from what was supposed to be a 2-day trek. Her car was still in the Iceberg Lake trailhead lot, covered in 4 inches of fresh snow. Her emergency beacon had activated 48 hours ago, then gone silent. The tracks led him to the tent. It stood in a clearing that shouldn't exist. Steven knew this trail, knew every turn and switchback, and there had never been a clearing here. But the trees formed a perfect circle around the small dome tent, their trunks bent inward at impossible angles, as if they'd grown that way over decades, despite the fact that Steven had hiked this exact route last October without seeing anything unusual. The tent was Columbia brand, green and gray, the kind you could pick up at any outdoor store. It wasn't covered in snow despite the storm that had blown through yesterday. Madison's boots sat outside the entrance, placed side by side with military precision, the laces tied together in a complex knot that Stephen recognized from his Navy days. A bosun's hitch, the kind used to secure lines under extreme tension. He called out, "Madison Garcia? Park Service, are you in there?" The wind died completely. In the sudden silence, Stephen heard breathing, slow, measured, coming from inside the tent. Not the rapid panting of hypothermia or injury, something patient, something waiting. His hand moved to the pepper spray on his belt, then stopped. Pepper spray wouldn't help if Madison was hurt, wouldn't help if she was confused, hypothermic, seeing him as a threat. He'd done this before. He could do it again. "Madison, I'm Ranger Torres. Your roommate reported you overdue. I'm here to help." The breathing continued. Steady. Inhale for 4 counts. Exhale for 4, like meditation, like prayer. Stephen unzipped the tent fly. Madison Garcia sat cross-legged in the center, wearing only thermal underwear despite the cold. Her skin was blue-white, the color of skim milk, but she wasn't shivering. Her eyes were open, focused on something above Stephen's head, and her lips moved in silent repetition of words he couldn't hear. Between her hands she held a knife, not a camping blade, but something older, bone-handled, the edge dark with what looked like dried blood. Around her, carved into the tent floor with methodical precision, were symbols. Stephen didn't recognize the language, but he recognized the intent. Warding signs, protection circles, the desperate mathematics of someone trying to keep something out, or keep something in. "Madison," he said softly, the way you'd speak to a spooked horse, "I need you to put down the knife." Her eyes flicked to him, and for a moment Stephen saw recognition, fear, relief. Then something else slid behind her pupils, something that looked at him with hunger so profound it made his stomach cramp in sympathetic echo. "Too late," she whispered. Her voice sounded wrong, layered, as if multiple throats spoke in imperfect unison. "It's already inside." She drove the knife into her own thigh. Stephen lunged forward, grabbed her wrist, twisted the blade free. Blood welled dark and thick, but Madison didn't scream. She laughed instead, high and broken, and her breath smelled like meat gone bad. He yanked his medical kit from his pack, fumbled for gauze, applied pressure to the wound while she giggled and whispered words in a language that predated English by millennia. "Wendigo," she said, switching back to English abruptly. "That's what the old man called it, at the ranger station. He tried to warn me." "What old man?" Stephen wrapped the wound tight, hands working on autopilot while his mind raced. There hadn't been anyone at the station when Madison checked in 4 days ago. The logs showed only her signature. "The one with no face," Madison said, and then she started singing. A children's song, but the melody was off by half tones, creating dissonance that made Stephen's teeth ache. "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall." She stopped mid-word, head tilting at an angle too sharp, listening to something Stephen couldn't hear. Then she smiled, and her teeth were red with blood she'd bitten from her own tongue. "It's not hunting me anymore," she said. "It's hunting you." The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 3 seconds. Stephen's breath crystallized mid-exhale, ice forming on his beard, on his eyelashes. The tent walls frosted over, and through the fabric he saw shadows moving, circling, too tall and too thin to be human. The breathing he'd heard earlier started again, but now it came from everywhere, from the trees, from the ground, from inside his own chest. Madison's wound stopped bleeding, just stopped, the blood freezing solid in the gauze, and her skin began to ripple like something underneath was trying to push through. Stephen grabbed his radio. "Base, this is Torres. I have Madison Garcia. She's hypothermic," and the radio exploded in his hand. Not broke, exploded. Circuits and plastic and battery acid spraying across the tent floor, the components flash-frozen mid-destruction. His Garmin GPS died next, the screen cracking in a spiderweb pattern as the liquid crystal froze solid. His backup compass spun wildly, needle pointing at Madison's chest, then at the tent entrance, then at the sky, refusing to settle on magnetic north. "You should have stayed away," Madison said. But now her voice came from behind him. Stephen spun. She was still sitting in the same position, hadn't moved, but her reflection in the metal water bottle showed her standing, reaching for him with hands that had too many fingers. The tent rip opened from outside, not unzipped, ripped, the fabric tearing in a vertical slash that revealed the clearing beyond. Except the clearing wasn't the same. The trees were closer, their branches interlocked overhead in patterns that looked like rib cages, and the snow had turned red with something that wasn't rust. Standing in the tree line was Danny Reeves, 5 years dead, frozen solid at the bottom of a ravine, body cremated and scattered in a memorial service Stephen had attended with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. But here he stood, wearing the same clothes he'd disappeared in, faced the same age he'd been at 29, except his eyes were empty sockets that somehow still saw. "Run," Danny said, and his jaw didn't move, the words emanating from the frozen air itself. "It's not finished with us yet." Stephen didn't run. Couldn't. His legs had locked, muscles refusing signals from a brain that had temporarily shorted out under the weight of impossibility. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. Hypothermia caused hallucinations, caused shared delusions, caused... Madison grabbed his face with both hands and forced him to look at her. Her pupils had dilated so wide there was no iris left, just black holes pulling light inward, and in that darkness, Stephen saw things moving. Shapes with antlers and elongated limbs, crawling across the landscape of her mind like parasites across a host's skin. "Listen," she hissed, and her breath was cold enough to burn. It came down from the north 3 winters ago. The Blackfeet elders knew. They tried to warn the rangers, but no one believed them. They said the Wendigo walks when the hunger gets too strong, when someone crosses the line and tastes what shouldn't be tasted. It doesn't just kill. It transforms, it spreads. "Wendigo isn't real," Stephen said, but his voice broke on the last word. "It's a myth. A cultural metaphor for what?" Madison's laugh was sharp enough to cut. "For greed, for cannibalism. It's not a metaphor when it's standing in front of you, Ranger Torres. It's not a myth when it's wearing your friend's face." Danny, or what wore Danny's corpse, took a step closer. Ice cracked beneath his feet, spreading in fractal patterns that looked too deliberate to be natural. Behind him, more shapes emerged from the tree line. People Stephen recognized from old missing persons reports, hikers who'd vanished over the years, their cases closed with the clinical efficiency of bureaucratic acceptance. They all had the same empty eyes, the same wrong way of moving, joints bending in directions that violated anatomy. "You felt it, didn't you?" Madison's voice had softened to almost gentle. "After Danny died, that hunger, that emptiness that nothing could fill. You thought it was grief, but grief doesn't make you want to consume. Grief doesn't make you dream of eating the world." Stephen's stomach cramped violently and he tasted copper. Not metaphorical, actual copper. The same taste from the melted pennies outside. His vision doubled, tripled, and suddenly he was seeing through multiple perspectives. His own eyes, Madison's black hole pupils, the empty sockets of Danny's reanimated corpse, all of them staring at the same point in space, at something that existed between the trees, something so tall its head disappeared into cloud cover that hadn't been there a moment ago. The Wendigo was skeletal and massive, 15 feet tall with antlers that branched into fractals, each point sharp enough to pierce reality. Its skin was ice blue and translucent, showing the organs underneath, organs that still moved despite being frozen solid. Its mouth was a lipless gash filled with teeth that had grown in multiple rows, some pointing inward to prevent prey from escaping once caught. But worst was its stomach, distended and swollen, bulging with shapes that pressed against the translucent skin from inside. Faces of the consumed still visible and still screaming soundlessly. It looked at Stephen with eyes like chips of black ice, and he felt the hunger slam into him with physical force, not for food. He understood now that food was just the gateway, The first transgression. The true hunger was for warmth, for life, for everything that moved and breathed and existed in a way the Wendigo no longer could. It wanted to consume the world not for sustenance but for the brief moment of heat as something alive passed into something dead. "I didn't mean to," Madison whispered. She was crying now, tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. "The storm came so fast, I got turned around, found a cabin, but there was someone else there, or what was left of someone. I was so hungry, so cold. I just wanted to survive." Stephen understood then what had happened, what always happened, the terrible arithmetic of survival when pushed beyond the breaking point. The line that seemed so clear in civilization became blurred in the wilderness, became invisible when death whispered that taking just a small piece would be worth it to see tomorrow. "How much, he asked, and his voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else's throat. "Enough," she said. The Wendigo took another step closer, and the temperature dropped further. Stephen's thoughts began to slow, synapses firing through ice, and with the cold came a strange clarity. He understood now why Danny had walked 8 miles from his camp, understood why his stomach had been full of bark and needles. Danny had been trying to fill the hunger with anything except what it truly wanted, trying to deny the transformation even as it consumed him from inside. The other shapes, the missing hikers, formed a circle around the tent. They were all in different stages of transformation, some still mostly human, others already becoming something else. The Wendigo made them, Madison had said, but that wasn't quite right. The Wendigo didn't make anything. It just revealed what was already there, the capacity for consumption that lived in every human heart, waiting for the right circumstances to wake it up. "You can't fight it," Madison said, and she sounded sad, resigned. "Once it marks you, once you see it, the hunger starts. You feel it now, don't you? That empty place inside that nothing will ever fill again." Stephen did feel it, a hollow ache in his chest, spreading outward, making his stomach cramp and his mouth water with saliva that tasted like metal. He thought about the granola bars in his pack, the freeze-dried meals, the emergency rations, and none of them seemed adequate. None of them would touch the void that had opened inside him. But he also felt something else. The memory of Danny's funeral, watching his parents cry while holding a flag that represented a body too damaged to display. The memory of Madison's roommate on the phone, voice breaking as she described how Madison had promised to call every night, had promised to be careful. The memory of every person he'd ever rescued or recovered, the weight of their lives and deaths adding up to something that mattered more than his own survival. "No," he said. Madison blinked. "What?" "No," Stephen repeated, and he forced himself to his feet. His legs shook, muscles screaming protest, but he stood. "I won't." The Wendigo's head tilted, considering. Around the clearing, the transformed hikers took a collective step forward, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested a single, controlling intelligence. Stephen reached for his pack, found the emergency flare gun he'd carried for 12 years and never needed to use. "The Blackfeet have stories," he said, hands working on autopilot to load the flare. "Not just about the Wendigo, about how to stop it. Fire, not regular fire, purifying fire. The kind that burns away corruption." "You can't burn us all," Madison said, but there was hope in her voice now. Desperate, terrible hope. "And even if you could, it would just find others. It always does. It's hunger, Ranger Torres. Hunger never dies." "No," Stephen agreed. "But people can choose to starve." He fired the flare directly into the Wendigo's distended stomach. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The creature's translucent skin ignited, but the fire wasn't normal flame. It burned blue-white and cold, frost fire that spread across the Wendigo's body in patterns that looked like veins. The thing opened its mouth to scream, and the sound that emerged was every voice it had ever consumed screaming in unison. Hunters and prey, predator and victim, all of them burning together. The circle of transformed hikers collapsed as one, their bodies hitting the ground like puppets with cut strings. Madison gasped, her eyes clearing for just a moment, long enough for Stephen to see the real her underneath the possession. She mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Then the fire spread to her. Stephen lurched forward, but it was too late. The frost flame consumed her in seconds, reducing her body to ash that blew away on a wind that came from nowhere. The tent collapsed, burning away in the same blue-white fire. The trees around the clearing began to crack, ice forming on their bark in patterns that looked like screaming faces. The Wendigo burned brightest of all. As it died, Stephen saw the shapes inside its stomach clearly. Not bodies, but something else. Souls, maybe, or whatever remained after the flesh was consumed. They poured out through the flame, translucent and formless, and for a moment he saw Danny among them. His friend looked at him with eyes that were finally, mercifully empty of hunger, and nodded once before dissolving into light. Then the Wendigo was gone. The clearing was gone. The circle of trees had vanished, leaving Stephen standing in the middle of the normal trail, the one he'd hiked dozens of times with nothing around him but fresh snow and silence. His radio was intact on his belt. His GPS showed his position exactly where it should be. The thermometer read 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold, but not impossible. It was as if the last hour had never happened, except for the ash on his gloves, except for the memory of Madison's eyes clearing at the end, except for the hollow ache in his chest that wasn't quite hunger but wasn't quite nothing either. Stephen stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, watching his breath fog in the air. Normal air. Air that didn't carry the scent of copper or the whisper of ancient languages. He thought about calling base, about explaining what had happened, about filing a report that no one would believe. Instead, he knelt in the snow and said a prayer, not to any specific god, but to the wilderness itself, to the old powers that had been here before humans and would remain after. A prayer of acknowledgement, of respect, of understanding that some hungers were too dangerous to feed, and some lines too important to cross no matter the cost. When he finally stood and started the long hike back to base, he didn't look behind him, didn't need to. He could feel the forest watching, evaluating, deciding whether he'd learned the lesson or just postponed the inevitable. The hollow ache in his chest remained, a permanent reminder. But Stephen had spent 5 years living with guilt. He could live with hunger too. 3 months later, Stephen Torres submitted his resignation from the National Park Service. He didn't explain why to his supervisors, just thanked them for the opportunity and packed his belongings into boxes with the methodical care of someone who'd made an irrevocable decision. His replacement would arrive in 2 weeks, a young ranger fresh from training who looked at the mountains with the kind of wonder Stephen couldn't remember feeling anymore. On his last day, an elderly man appeared at the ranger station. Stephen had never seen him before. He was Blackfeet, maybe in his 70s, with hair like steel wire and eyes that had seen too much. He didn't speak, just placed a small leather pouch on Stephen's desk and nodded once before leaving. Inside the pouch were herbs Stephen didn't recognize, a small silver pendant engraved with protection symbols, and a note written in careful, cramped handwriting. The hunger never fully leaves, but you can learn to feed it other things. Dreams, stories, purpose. These help. The elders are watching. We remember those who choose correctly. Stephen kept the pouch in his truck's glove compartment as he drove away from Glacier National Park for the last time. He'd already accepted a position teaching wilderness survival at a community college in Missoula, still connected to the outdoors but with walls and heat and people around. Still useful, but safer, for everyone. At night, when the hollow ache intensified and his dreams turned dark, he would open the pouch and breathe in the herb's sharp scent. It helped a little. Not enough to erase what he'd seen, what he'd felt, but enough to keep him human. He thought about Madison Garcia often, about how she'd fought even after consumption, about how she'd tried to warn him despite the thing inside her. Her family had been given a closed-casket funeral. The official report stated death by exposure and animal predation, which was technically true if you didn't specify what kind of animal. Stephen attended from the back row, didn't speak to anyone, left before the reception. He thought about Danny too, about that final moment of peace in his friend's eyes as the frost fire released whatever the Wendigo had kept trapped. Stephen hoped Danny was at rest now, hoped all of them were. Madison, the other lost hikers, the countless victims consumed over centuries by the hunger that walked on two legs and wore the shape of human need. But mostly, Stephen thought about the choice. The moment when Madison had reached for forbidden sustenance and crossed the line, believing it would save her. He understood that desperation now in a way he never had before, understood how thin civilization's veneer really was, how quickly the rules that seemed absolute could start to look like suggestions when survival hung in the balance. The hollow ache in his chest was a reminder. He'd stood at that same precipice and stepped back. But the edge was still there, would always be there waiting for the next moment of weakness. On clear winter nights when the temperature dropped and the wind carried sounds from the mountains, Stephen would stand outside his apartment and look north toward Glacier. Sometimes he imagined he could see figures moving in the distant tree line, impossibly tall, impossibly thin. Sometimes he imagined he could hear them calling, their voices layered and wrong, promising warmth and fullness and an end to the ache. He never answered, never would, but he listened, and that was the most honest thing he'd ever done. Because pretending the Wendigo didn't exist was how people ended up feeding it. Pretending the hunger wasn't real was how it grew strong enough to consume. Stephen Torres had seen what lived in the spaces between need and taboo, had felt its pull, had watched good people become monsters not through malice but through the simple mathematics of survival pushed past breaking points. He would carry that knowledge for the rest of his life, would teach his students about weather patterns and equipment maintenance and emergency protocols, but would also teach them about the other dangers, the ones that came from inside, the ones that waited patiently in the hollow spaces of human hearts fed by fear and desperation and the fundamental loneliness of existence. And every year on the anniversary of Madison Garcia's death, Stephen would drive to the Blackfeet Reservation and leave tobacco at the Cultural Center, a gesture of respect he'd learned from the old man. The elders would nod when they saw him, recognition without words, understanding that he was one of the marked ones, someone who'd seen and survived, but would never be completely free. The hunger was eternal. But so was the choice to resist it, and in the end, Stephen had learned that was the only thing that separated humans from monsters. Not the absence of hunger, but the decision, made new each day, not to feed it no matter the cost. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The tent was still zipped from the inside. Benjamin Reeves stood 3 feet from the entrance, hands on his hips, studying the configuration with the same methodical attention he applied to every anomaly in his 14 years as a ranger. The Coleman 4-season tent showed no tears, no forced entry, no signs of wildlife interference. The zipper pulls hung at their proper position. Interior side, secured together with the small metal clip Lucas Webb had mentioned in his check-in call 5 days ago. A nervous habit, he'd said, from his years backpacking through grizzly country. The Hoh rainforest pressed close on all sides, that peculiar Pacific Northwest density where Sitka spruce and western hemlock grew so thick that noon looked like dusk. Moss hung from branches in curtains of prehistoric green. Everything dripped, everything waited. Benjamin circled the tent twice, GPS unit in hand, a Garmin GPS map 60 CSX, the same model he'd carried since the department upgraded in 2006. The coordinates matched exactly what dispatch had pulled from Webb's last satellite phone ping, 47.8023 DN, 123.8956 DQ, approximately 8 miles southeast of the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center, well off the maintained trail system. Webb had obtained the proper backcountry permit, everything by the book, except the tent was zipped from the inside, and Lucas Webb was gone. Benjamin had seen strange things in Olympic National Park. He'd found hikers who'd wandered miles off trail, insistent they'd been following blue blazes that didn't exist. He'd recovered bodies from falls where the victims had inexplicably removed their boots before going over. He'd documented odd animal behavior that the biologists at the station catalogued with frowns and non-committal murmurs. But each incident had eventually yielded to rational explanation. Dehydration, hypothermia, head trauma. The human brain could convince itself of remarkable fictions when survival systems began failing. This was just another puzzle. Benjamin had always been good at puzzles. He keyed the Motorola XPR 7550 radio clipped to his shoulder. Reeves to base. I've located the Webb campsite. Subject is not present. Campsite appears intact but unoccupied. Beginning evidence documentation. The radio crackled. Copy that, Ben. Want me to call in SNR protocol? Negative. Let me sweep the immediate area first. Webb might have gotten disoriented, wandered off. I'll check the surrounding grid. Benjamin knew the statistics. 70% of lost hikers were found within 3 miles of their last known location. Usually they'd tried to find water and gotten turned around. I'll radio in 30. Copy. Be safe out there. Benjamin approached the tent. The forest floor was deep Olympic duff, decades of decomposed needles and moss that gave no clear tracks. He photographed the tent from 4 angles with his department-issue Nikon, then unzipped the entrance. The smell hit him first. Not decay. The tent was too well ventilated for that, mesh panels on 3 sides, but something else. Incense, maybe. Sandalwood and something sharper. Medicinal. Benjamin logged it mentally and stepped inside. Everything was arranged with almost ritualistic precision. Webb's sleeping bag lay flat and smooth, as if carefully smoothed rather than slept in. A MSR Dragonfly camp stove sat in the corner, fuel canister beside it, both untouched. Food bag hung from the ridgeline, proper bear protocol still sealed. Water bottles lined up along one wall, each exactly 3/4 full. The orange dry bag Webb had listed on his permit application sat in the far corner. And on the sleeping bag, centered perfectly, lay a journal. Benjamin pulled on latex gloves from his first aid kit before picking it up. Standard moleskin, black cover, elastic closure. He opened it. The first entry was dated October 12, 2008, 8 days ago. First night in the hoe. Everything you'd expect. Mosquitoes worse than I remember from my last trip in '04. Found this campsite by following what looked like a game trail, probably elk. Coordinates logged in case I need to relocate. Something about this spot feels right. Quiet. Old. Benjamin flipped forward. The handwriting remained neat, controlled, precisely the kind of script you'd expect from a software engineer who'd spent his life organizing information into clean systems. Lucas Webb's employment verification had listed him as a senior developer at Microsoft's Redmond campus. Degree in computer science from MIT. Hiked recreationally for stress relief. 36 years old. Never married. His emergency contact was a sister in Vermont. October 13, 2008. Heard something last night. Not wildlife. I know those sounds. This was different. Rhythmic. Like breathing, but too slow, too deep. Probably just whined through the trees, creating weird acoustics. The density here plays tricks. Explored north today. Found an old cedar about 2 miles out that's been stripped of bark in a pattern. Not bear marking. Too deliberate. Almost looks like Japanese characters, but that's ridiculous. Maybe old survey marks from logging days, though this area should be virgin growth. Benjamin's frown deepened. He'd worked these sectors for more than a decade. There were no logging roads this deep in the hoe. The valley had been protected since the park's establishment in 1938. October 14th, 2008. The breathing sound again. Closer. I timed it. 7 seconds between each exhale. That's not natural. That's not anything. Found more markings. Same characters. Same deliberate style. They form a pattern. I mapped it on the GPS. 5 trees arranged in a rough circle about 50 yards across. My camp is dead center. I should leave. That would be the smart thing. But I'm a rational person. There's an explanation. Survey marks. Some old Forest Service project. Vandalism from decades ago. I'm not going to spook myself with ghost stories. Benjamin stood. Through the tent's mesh panels, the forest presented its usual dense green monotony. Nothing moved. Nothing made sound beyond the eternal whisper of water dripping from infinite surfaces. He continued reading. October 15th, 2008. I found it today, half a mile northeast. An old campsite, or maybe a dwelling. Stone foundation, mostly covered by moss. Looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But in the center, under a flat rock, I moved aside. Stupid, I know, but I was curious. There was a metal box. Inside, photographs. Black and white, old, 1940s maybe. A woman, young, Japanese. In several photos, she's with a white man, maybe 40. They look happy in the early shots. Then the photos change. She's alone. She looks scared. The final photo shows her near this very spot. I recognize the trees. Her expression is... I can't describe her expression. There was also a letter, in Japanese. I can't read it, but I photographed it. I'll try to get it translated when I get back to civilization. Benjamin flipped the page. The handwriting had changed. Still legible, but less controlled. Faster. October 16th, 2008. The breathing is inside my tent. I know how that sounds. I know what I'd think if someone told me that. But I can hear it. 7-second intervals, directly above me. I've checked outside 4 times. Nothing. But when I'm inside, always. I'm leaving tomorrow. First light. This was a mistake. All of it was a mistake. The next entry was barely a paragraph scrawled quickly. October 17th, 2008, 6:47 a.m. Can't find the trail. Tried to leave. GPS says I'm walking northwest, but I keep ending up back here. 5 times. 5 times. The coordinates are correct. The compass is correct. But the forest. The trees have faces now. I know that's not possible. I know. But when I'm not looking directly at them, in my peripheral vision, the bark patterns look like faces. Always the same face. Her face. The photos are gone. I put them back in the metal box. Buried it again. But they're in my tent now, arranged on my sleeping bag. 7 photos, and they've changed. In all of them, she's looking directly at the camera. That's not how they were before. Benjamin's hand tightened on the journal. He looked at the sleeping bag. No photos. He checked the entire tent. Nothing. October 18th, 2008. Time is wrong. My watch says 3 p.m., but it's dark. Actually dark. Stars out. But when I check my watch again, it says 3 p.m. Same time. Always 3 p.m. She was standing outside the tent last night. I saw her through the mesh. White dress. Black hair covering her face. She didn't move. Just stood there for, I don't know, hours. When I finally looked away and looked back, she was closer, right against the mesh. I could hear her breathing, 7-second intervals. I tried the radio, just static. Satellite phone won't acquire signal even though there's clear sky. I'm documenting this because someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand what happened here. There was a photograph with the letter. I didn't mention it before. Didn't want to write it down, but I need to now. The white man, he's in military uniform. Army. The photo shows him with his hand on her throat. She's on the ground. The next photo. God. The next photo. This place. This exact place. This is where it happened. 60 years ago or 70 years ago, during the war, Japanese internment. She must have escaped, made it this far, and he. She's not gone. She never left. And now I've disturbed her. I've seen her. I've read her letter. I've completed something I don't understand. If someone finds this, don't read the letter. Don't translate it. Don't. The entry stopped mid-sentence. Benjamin flipped the page. One final entry, written in different handwriting. Neater, more deliberate, feminine. October 19th, 2008. He understands now. You will too. Benjamin dropped the journal. His hands were shaking. A purely physiological response to the adrenaline spike, he told himself. The rational explanation was clear. Lucas Webb had experienced a psychological break. Isolation-induced psychosis. It happened. The journal entries were a documentation of declining mental health, probably triggered by dehydration or exposure to natural toxins. Some mushrooms in the Pacific Northwest could cause vivid hallucinations. But the last entry, the handwriting change. Benjamin picked up the journal again, carefully. He'd bag it as evidence. The disappearance was now officially a search and rescue operation with possible mental health crisis. He'd call it in, get a team out here by morning, expand the search grid. His Motorola crackled, not with a voice, with white noise, rhythmic and pulsing. 7 seconds of static, 7 seconds of silence, 7 seconds of static. Base, this is Reeves. Radio check. Nothing. Base, do you copy? The static continued its pattern. Benjamin stepped out of the tent. The forest had changed. Not visibly. The trees were still trees, the moss still moss. But the quality of light had shifted. It was 2:47 p.m. according to his watch. Should be decent daylight even in the dense canopy. But the shadows seemed wrong. Too long. Too angular. He pulled out his GPS unit. The coordinates were correct. Same position. But when he checked his stored waypoints for the route back to the main trail, they were gone. All of them. Just blank memory. That's not possible, he said aloud. The GPS used flash memory. It didn't just delete, not without user input. He tried manual navigation, pulled out his compass. The needle spun lazily, unable to find north. He tapped it. The needle continued its slow rotation, describing perfect circles. Benjamin's heart rate elevated. He recognized the physiological response. Quickened pulse, heightened awareness, peripheral vision narrowing. Classic stress reaction, manageable. He'd been trained for this. He would walk out. No GPS, no compass. Fine. The sun was west. He could see patches of sky through the canopy. Navigate by dead reckoning. He'd done it before during training exercises. Benjamin started walking northwest. He counted steps. One of the old tricks. 600 steps would be roughly a quarter mile at his normal pace. At 600 steps, he checked his position by landmarks. That distinctive spruce with the split trunk. He'd passed it already. 15 minutes ago, walking in the opposite direction. Impossible. He tried again. Different direction. Due north. Counted steps. At 400, he found himself approaching his original position. The tent was visible through the trees. Benjamin stopped. His breathing had quickened despite his attempts to control it. This wasn't panic. This was data. Information that didn't fit his model of reality. He just needed to expand the model. Find the explanation. He returned to the tent and went through Lucas Webb's belongings more thoroughly. The dry bag contained spare clothing, all folded precisely. A paperback copy of Gravity's Rainbow, bookmarked about halfway through. A first aid kit, unused, and at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag, a metal box. Benjamin opened it. No photographs. Just a letter, yellowed paper covered in Japanese characters, and a small object wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully. A wooden comb, dark with age. Strands of long black hair still clung to its teeth. The temperature dropped, not gradually, instantly. Benjamin could see his breath. He looked up. Through the tent's mesh panel, in his peripheral vision, something white stood between the trees. Benjamin turned his head to look directly at it. Nothing there. But when he looked away, focused on the tent wall beside him, the white shape reappeared in his peripheral vision. Closer now. "This isn't real," he said. His voice sounded too loud. Hallucination, carbon monoxide from the stove maybe, or... The breathing started. 7 seconds of silence. 7 seconds of exhalation. Deep, rattling, wrong. 7 seconds of silence. It came from directly above the tent. Benjamin's training kicked in. In emergency situations, you followed protocol. He grabbed his radio. Mayday, Mayday, this is Ranger Reeves, badge number 2847, declaring emergency at coordinates. The radio screamed. Not static, an actual scream, high-pitched and prolonged and inhuman. Benjamin dropped it. His hands were shaking badly now. He recognized this as significant. He never shook. He'd pulled bodies from the Ho River in January without shaking. He'd talked down a suicidal hiker on a cliff edge without shaking. But now his hands trembled like leaves. The white shape was inside the tent. Benjamin could see it in his peripheral vision. Tall, humanoid, long black hair covering where a face should be. White dress, old-fashioned, hanging perfectly straight despite no wind. He forced himself to turn, to look directly at it. Nothing. Empty tent. He looked away. It was closer. Directly beside him now, kneeling next to the sleeping bag, the smell intensified. Not incense. He understood that now. It was decay masked by sandalwood, something old and preserved trying to smell clean. "You're not real," Benjamin said. His voice shook. "You're a manifestation of psychological stress. Pattern recognition gone wrong. The human brain constructs narratives from incomplete data. That's all this is." The breathing stopped. In the new silence, Benjamin could hear his own heartbeat. Too fast, irregular. He could hear water dripping from 10,000 leaves. He could hear something moving through the undergrowth, circling the tent, slow and deliberate. The letter. Lucas had written not to read it, not to translate it. But Lucas had read it. Lucas had translated it, or tried to, and Lucas was gone. Benjamin picked up the letter with shaking hands. He couldn't read Japanese, but he could see that it was short, maybe 100 characters. Some were repeated, the same complex symbol appearing multiple times. He photographed it with the Nikon. The flash illuminated the tent interior. In that brief moment of white light, he saw something that made his breath stop. Writing on the tent wall. Fresh. Red. Not English. Japanese characters, dozens of them, covering the interior fabric in neat rows. The flash died. The tent returned to its shadowy gloom. Benjamin looked at the wall. Nothing there. Clean yellow fabric. He checked the camera's display screen. The image showed the writing clearly. Unmistakable. Benjamin's hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the camera. He forced himself to think through the terror, to analyze. Cameras could capture things invisible to the human eye, certain wavelengths, afterimages, double exposures. There was an explanation, but he knew, somewhere beneath his rational mind, in the ancient structures that predated language and logic, he knew. The white shape appeared directly in front of him. Not in peripheral vision, directly before him, solid and real. Benjamin screamed. The sound was involuntary, raw, something pulled from his chest without permission. She was young, maybe 20. The hair was black and thick, hanging in wet strands that covered most of her face. What he could see of her skin was pale, waxy, wrong. Her dress, traditional Japanese, a kimono, white as bone, hung perfectly still. Her hands emerged from the sleeves. The fingers were too long, the joints bending at angles that shouldn't exist. She raised them slowly toward Benjamin. He scrambled backward, hit the tent wall, became tangled in fabric. The rational part of his mind screamed explanations, hallucination, psychotic break, toxin exposure. But the rest of him knew. She was real. She had always been real. The letter had described what happened to her, and Lucas Webb had read it, had completed something, had invited her acknowledgement. And Benjamin had found the letter, had touched the comb, had walked the circle of marked trees unknowingly, had completed the same ritual. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Whatever happened to you, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I don't understand." The figure tilted her head. The hair shifted slightly. Beneath it, Benjamin caught a glimpse of her face. He wished he hadn't. The mouth was wrong. Too wide. Opening too far. The teeth. Benjamin bolted from the tent. He ran without direction, without thought, pure panic overriding 14 years of training. Branches whipped his face. His boots caught on roots. He fell, scrambled up, ran again. Behind him, he could hear breathing, 7-second intervals, keeping pace no matter how fast he ran. He burst into a clearing and stopped. In the center stood 5 trees, each one stripped of bark in precise patterns. The Japanese characters Lucas had described. Benjamin stood in the exact center of their circle. He was back at the campsite. The tent was 20 feet away. "No," he said. "No, no, no." He tried again. Different direction. Ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out. Stopped. The tent was 30 feet away. Same clearing. Same 5 marked trees. Benjamin sank to his knees. His mind was trying to reject what was happening, trying to force it into a framework that made sense. Temporal loop, spatial anomaly, electromagnetic interference affecting his perceptions, but he could see her now, standing at the tree line, hair hanging, dress white and clean and impossible. And behind her, another figure, Lucas Webb. He looked intact, whole, not decomposed, but his eyes were wrong, empty, staring without seeing. Benjamin understood then. Really understood. This wasn't about death. It was about something worse. Lucas had tried to leave, had walked out of the circle, had completed whatever pattern governed this place. And now he was part of it. Not dead, not alive. Something else. "Please," Benjamin said. He was crying. When had he started crying? "I didn't know. I'll leave. I'll never come back. Please." The woman moved closer. Not walking, gliding, her feet not touching the ground. Lucas followed, his movements stiff and jerky, puppet-like. Benjamin's radio crackled to life. His own voice emerged from the speaker. "This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't real." His watch read 3 p.m. It had read 3 p.m. for hours. The journal. Lucas had documented everything, had tried to warn whoever came after. Benjamin pulled out the journal from his pack where he'd stashed it. He flipped to the last entry. New writing had appeared, his own handwriting, though he didn't remember writing it. October 20th, 2008. I understand now. The letter explains everything. She was brought here during the war. She lived in Seattle, Japantown, before the internment. Her name was Yuki Nakamura. When they came for her family, she ran, made it this far. An army patrol found her. One soldier stayed behind when the others left. What he did to her, the letter describes it. She wrote it before she died. Blood for ink. A curse and a cry and a promise. The trees remember. The earth remembers. This place is hers now. She doesn't want to hurt anyone. She just wants to be seen, to be acknowledged, to have someone understand what happened here. But once you understand, once you really see her, you can't leave, because seeing her means being seen by her, and she's been alone for so long. Benjamin stared at the words. He didn't remember writing them, but that was his handwriting, his pen. He looked up. She was inches away now. He could smell the decay beneath the sandalwood, could hear the breathing, slow and deep and deliberate. She raised one too long hand and touched his face. Her fingers were ice and fire and ancient pain all at once. And suddenly Benjamin could see, not with his eyes, with something deeper. He saw the small apartment in Seattle where she'd lived with her parents and younger brother. Saw the panic when the notices came. The desperate flight into the mountains, always looking back. The relief when she thought she'd made it far enough. The soldier's face. Young. Scared. Following orders until orders ran out and baser instincts took over. The letter written in blood. The curse spoken with a dying breath. The promise that she would remain, that she would wait, that anyone who found this place would understand. Benjamin was screaming. He realized he'd been screaming for several minutes. The images wouldn't stop. Her terror, her pain, her death, slow and cold and alone. And then the years after. Consciousness without life. Awareness without body. Trapped in this circle of trees, this prison of her own making. Unable to leave, unable to rest, unable to do anything but wait for someone to see her, to really see her. Lucas had seen her, had pieced together the story from the photographs and letter, had tried to leave. But the circle was complete. The curse was active. Once you entered, once you understood, you couldn't leave. You became part of the waiting. Benjamin felt himself changing, not physically, worse than that. His thoughts were slowing, his memories becoming distant and foggy. The terror was fading, replaced by a different feeling. Patient waiting, eternal watching, the need for someone to understand. He picked up his pen. The journal was open before him. His hand moved across the page. If you're reading this, you found us. There are 3 of us now. Yuki, who waits. Lucas, who understood too late. Me, who thought logic could explain away the impossible. Don't try to leave. You're already part of the circle. The moment you touched this journal, you completed the pattern. The moment you read these words, you became seen. She just wants you to understand. That's all she's ever wanted. The breathing will start soon, 7-second intervals. That's how you'll know she's close. Don't be afraid, or be afraid. It doesn't matter. Fear or acceptance, the result is the same. We'll be here when you arrive, all of us, waiting in the clearing. The tent will still be zipped from the inside. It always is. Benjamin set down the pen. His watch read 3:00 p.m. It would always read 3:00 p.m. In his peripheral vision, he could see Lucas standing motionless near the tree line. Beyond him, others. How many? 7? 12? More? All standing perfectly still. All waiting. Benjamin stood. His movements felt stiff, unnatural. He walked to the tree line and stopped, turned back toward the tent. The breathing started above him. 7 seconds of silence. 7 seconds of exhalation. 7 seconds of silence. He waited. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled. Static, in rhythmic patterns. A helicopter might be searching. A team might have been dispatched, but they wouldn't find the campsite. The coordinates were correct, but the place was somewhere else now. Somewhere adjacent to the normal world, but forever separate from it. The forest dripped. The moss grew. Time moved everywhere except here. Benjamin heard footsteps. Someone was approaching through the undergrowth. Another ranger, maybe, or a hiker who'd wandered off trail. Someone who would find the tent, still zipped from the inside. Someone who would find the journal and read it and understand. He turned his face toward the sound and waited. The breathing continued. 7 seconds. 7 seconds. 7 seconds. And in the clearing, in the exact center of the 5 marked trees, the tent sat undisturbed. Yellow fabric faded by years that had never passed. Zipper pulls hanging on the interior side. A journal resting on a sleeping bag that had been smoothed with ritualistic care. Inside, new pages had appeared. Blank and waiting. The forest dripped and waited with them. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The elk had been eaten from the inside out. Ashley Rodriguez knelt beside the carcass on the Hidden Lake Trail, her Nikon D90 documenting what shouldn't exist in any wildlife biology textbook. The animal's exterior remained intact, hide unbroken, legs positioned naturally as though the elk had simply laid down to rest at 7,200 feet elevation. But the body cavity was completely hollow, ribs picked clean with surgical precision. Every organ and muscle tissue consumed while somehow leaving the skin undamaged, like a deflated balloon stretched over empty framework. 6 years as a ranger in Glacier National Park, plus a master's degree in ecology from University of Montana, and Ashley had never encountered predation patterns like this. Bears left claw marks. Wolves scattered remains across 100-yard kill zones. Mountain lions cached their prey. This suggested something else entirely, something her scientific training refused to categorize. She checked her Garmin GPS map 64th, coordinates 48.6952 degree N, 130.7543 dig, approximately 2 miles northeast of Logan Pass, July 14, 2012. Temperature 72 degrees Fahrenheit according to her Kestrel 3000 weather meter. Perfect summer conditions in the Montana Rockies, yet her breath misted visibly as she photographed the impossible elk. The temperature anomaly made no sense. Ashley recorded the reading twice, checked calibration, confirmed the device functioned properly. 72 degrees ambient, but her exhalations produced vapor clouds, suggesting sub-freezing conditions. The phenomenon localized to a 15-foot radius around the carcass as though something had drained thermal energy from the immediate environment while feeding. Her Motorola XPR 755E crackled. "Rodriguez, this is base. Status update on the Martinez search?" Ashley keyed the transmit button. "Found something unusual on Hidden Lake Trail, mile marker 4.3, requesting veterinary consultation on atypical predation, also experiencing localized temperature inversion I can't explain." Static answered for 3 seconds before dispatcher Sarah Whitmore responded. "Copy that. We've got Dr. Chen on standby. But Ashley, we need you focused on Martinez. 48 hours missing. Exposure risk increasing. Wildlife analysis is secondary." "Understood. Proceeding with primary search pattern." Ashley stood, brushing dirt from her cargo pants. "But this predation is relevant. Whatever created this kill is active in Martinez's last known location." She'd reviewed Dakota Martinez's file that morning. 29 years old, experienced backcountry hiker from Missoula, reported missing by camping companions after failing to return from a solo sunrise hike on July 12th. Last seen heading toward Gunsight Lake at 0530 hours, carrying a Camelback hydration system, Sunto compass, and emergency beacon that remained frustratingly silent. Search teams had worked grid patterns for 36 hours, found nothing beyond boot prints that terminated abruptly at Reynolds Creek without crossing to the opposite bank. Boot prints that ended, Ashley thought, exactly like the missing tissue inside this elk. Present one moment, absent the next, with no logical transition between states. She circled the carcass, documenting from multiple angles. The animal showed no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no indication it had fled or fought, just emptiness where substance should exist. Violation of conservation of mass that made her want to check her own credentials to confirm she actually held advanced degrees in biological sciences. The forest was silent. That detail registered slowly, but once Ashley noticed the absence of sound, it consumed her attention completely. Glacier National Park in mid-July supported hundreds of bird species, maintained constant ambient noise from insects, featured regular distant sounds of meltwater streams. But here, in this impossible cold pocket surrounding the hollow elk, nature had gone completely quiet. Ashley activated her digital voice recorder. July 14th, 1347 hours, documenting audio profile of anomalous site. She paused, letting the recorder capture 30 seconds of nothing. Complete absence of biological sounds despite optimal habitat conditions. Temperature inversion without meteorological justification. Predation pattern inconsistent with any known North American carnivore. She should feel professional detachment, clinical curiosity about unexplained phenomena. Instead, Ashley felt the first whispers of something her scientific worldview had no framework for processing. Instinctive dread. The kind that evolved over millions of years to keep primates alive in environments where they weren't apex predators. Movement flickered at the edge of her peripheral vision. Ashley spun, hand dropping to the bear spray on her hip. Nothing. Just lodgepole pines and granite slopes. The Hidden Lake Trail continuing northeast toward higher elevations. But the movement had been real. Not animal real. Not something she could identify and catalog, but real nonetheless. A shadow where shadows shouldn't fall given the sun's position. a distortion in her visual field that suggested presence without confirming form. "Hello?" Her voice sounded too loud in the unnatural silence. "Dakota Martinez, if you can hear me, make a sound. Any sound. I'm Ranger Rodriguez from Logan Pass Station. We're conducting search and rescue." The silence deepened, became almost tactile, a pressure against her eardrums that made her want to pop her jaw to equalize. Ashley retrieved her Bushnell Trophy binoculars, scanned the tree line systematically. Her training emphasized grid pattern observation, dividing visual field into manageable sections, looking for color anomalies or geometric patterns that indicated human presence. She found boot prints instead, fresh boot prints emerging from the forest 30 yards ahead, leading directly toward her position. The prints appeared in the same Vasca Breeze pattern identified as Dakota Martinez's from the Reynolds Creek site. But these prints showed something the previous ones hadn't. They weren't walking prints, they were running prints. Deep toe impressions, displaced soil kicked backward, stride length suggesting sprint velocity. Someone had been running on this trail within the past few hours, running hard enough to leave distinct panic mechanics in the earth. Ashley followed the track line with her binoculars, tracing the prints backward toward their origin point. They emerged from dense forest understory approximately 50 yards upslope, descended toward the trail, then stopped. The prints terminated mid-stride, right foot in full extension, left foot never landing. As though Dakota Martinez had been running at full speed and simply vanished between steps, momentum carrying them into nowhere without transition or explanation. Ashley's mouth went dry. She'd investigated disappearances before, understood that people got lost, fell into ravines, succumbed to exposure. But people didn't vanish mid-stride, leaving physical evidence that violated basic physics. People didn't leave boot prints that ended in impossible ways while mysterious predators consumed elk from the inside without breaking skin. She approached the termination point slowly, camera documenting each step. The final print showed precise detail: Vasca Breeze tread pattern, men's size 9, slight wear on the right heel consistent with pronation. The print impressed into soil with enough force to suggest significant body weight in motion, and then nothing, just undisturbed forest floor continuing in all directions. Ashley knelt, touched the soil beyond the final print. Soft loam should have recorded subsequent footfalls easily. Instead, the earth remained pristine, untouched, as though Martinez had achieved liftoff or been plucked from the trail by something operating outside normal physical constraints. Her radio crackled again. This time the voice wasn't Sarah Whitmore's professional dispatcher tone. This time the sound was wrong, distorted, pitched too low, words stretched into incomprehensibility. "Ashley Rodriguez." Ashley grabbed the radio. "Repeat your last transmission. You're breaking up badly." No response. Just static, then silence, then a sound that made her scalp prickle with atavistic recognition. Breathing, heavy labored breathing through the radio, as though something with lung capacity far exceeding human norms was exhaling directly into a microphone somewhere in the wilderness. "Identify yourself," Ashley said, forcing her voice steady. "This is an emergency frequency. Unauthorized use is a federal offense." The breathing continued for 10 seconds. Then a voice emerged through the static, speaking words Ashley didn't understand but somehow recognized on a cellular level. "Widikau, Nipa, Kishkamo." Cree. The words were Cree, one of the Algonquian languages spoken by indigenous peoples across the northern forests. Ashley had learned basic phrases during cultural sensitivity training, knew enough to recognize hunger and eat among the distorted syllables. But the voice pronouncing them sounded wrong, like human vocal cords attempting sounds they weren't anatomically designed to produce. The transmission cut out mid-syllable. Ashley tried raising base station. "Rodriguez to Logan Pass, do you copy? I'm receiving unauthorized transmissions on this frequency. Request confirmation of radio security." Silence. Her radio showed full bars, indicated proper channel selection, displayed fully charged battery. But the device produced nothing beyond static that almost sounded like breathing if she listened too carefully. She switched to her backup comm system. Satellite phone, Iridium 9555 model, couldn't be jammed or interfered with by atmospheric conditions. The device powered up normally, showed satellite lock. But when Ashley tried connecting to Park Dispatch, the call failed immediately. She tried again. Same result. Tried her personal emergency contact. Failed. Tried 911. Failed. Every communication system simultaneously non-functional despite showing operational status. Ashley stood in the unnatural cold beside the impossible elk carcass, looking at boot prints that ended mid-stride, holding technological devices that worked perfectly, except for their actual intended purpose, and felt her scientific worldview beginning to fracture around the edges. She'd built her entire adult life on empiricism, on the principle that observable phenomena had discoverable explanations, that the universe operated according to consistent physical laws. Mystery was just unexplored territory, not evidence of the supernatural. Every strange occurrence she'd encountered during 6 years as a ranger had ultimately revealed rational causes. Strange lights were atmospheric phenomena. Mysterious sounds were mating elk. Missing persons were almost always found with logical explanations for their disappearance. But logic didn't explain elk consumed from within. Logic didn't explain boot prints terminating in thin air. Logic didn't explain radio transmissions in Cree from voices that shouldn't exist. Unless. Ashley pulled out her personal notebook, flipped to notes from mandatory cultural training conducted by Blackfeet Nation elders 3 years ago. The program had covered traditional territorial boundaries, sacred sites requiring special handling, and, she found the relevant page, legends that persisted across Algonquian cultures throughout the northern forests. Wendigo, Wetiko, Weetikau, different pronunciations of the same concept, spirits of insatiable hunger, creatures born from humans who violated cannibalism taboos, entities that consumed everything, flesh, spirit, warmth itself, leaving only emptiness behind. The training had presented these as cultural beliefs deserving respect, metaphors for greed and consumption, stories with psychological and moral purpose, not as literal descriptions of supernatural predators that hunted the Montana wilderness. Ashley had nodded through the presentation, filed it under interesting anthropology, and moved on to practical concerns like bear safety protocols and wilderness first aid. Because she was a scientist, and scientists didn't believe in monsters. Except here she stood, surrounded by evidence that refused to fit any scientific framework, while something in the forest spoke Cree through her radio and left human boot prints that ended between steps. She needed more data. Scientific method demanded hypothesis testing, collection of additional evidence, systematic elimination of alternative explanations. Ashley marked the termination point with bright orange surveyor's tape, photographed the site from multiple angles, then continued northeast on Hidden Lake Trail following the direction Martinez had been running. The temperature normalized after 50 yards, climbing back to the 72 degrees her weather meter insisted was accurate for July at this elevation. Birdsong returned gradually, tentatively, as though nature itself was cautious about reoccupying space something else had claimed. Ashley found the second site a quarter-mile farther up the trail. This time the evidence was less ambiguous, more viscerally disturbing. Something had been eating here. Not the clean surgical consumption that characterized the elk carcass, but frenzied, desperate feeding. The granite outcropping showed blood spatter patterns, drag marks, scattered equipment. A camelback hydration system torn open, contents frozen solid despite ambient temperature. A Sunto compass crushed flat as though stepped on by something with enormous weight. And on the rock face itself, carved with what looked like fingernails rather than tools, a message in English. Hungry, always hungry, can't stop eating, eating everything, help me before I eat. The handwriting deteriorated across the message, starting with relatively controlled letters and degenerating into frantic scratches. Ashley compared the writing to Dakota Martinez's signature from the missing person report, similar enough to potentially match, but the later portions showed motor control degradation, suggesting severe hypothermia or neurological impairment. She photographed the message, collected GPS coordinates, documented blood spatter patterns using her forensic training from seasonal law enforcement certifications. The blood was fresh, less than 12 hours old based on oxidation state. Type O positive according to the field test kit she carried for exactly these situations. Dakota Martinez's blood type per the missing person report, O positive. Ashley forced herself to think clinically, methodically, building a working hypothesis from available evidence. Hypothesis: Dakota Martinez had encountered something on this trail that triggered severe psychological break, possibly hypothermia-induced psychosis despite warm temperatures. Martinez had begun behaving irrationally, running, hiding, eventually carving messages that suggested paranoid delusions about being consumed by hunger. The hypothesis felt inadequate, even as Ashley constructed it. Hypothermia didn't explain temperature inversions. Psychological breaks didn't explain elk predation patterns. Paranoid delusions didn't make communication systems fail simultaneously. But the alternative, accepting that something called a Wendigo actually existed, actually hunted these mountains, actually transformed humans into cannibalistic spirits, that alternative required abandoning everything her education had taught her about reality's fundamental nature. Ashley stood at the crossroads between worldviews, forensic evidence in one hand, cultural mythology in the other, knowing that choosing wrong might cost her life. The sound started while she debated. Low, distant, rhythmic, almost like breathing but too slow. Each inhalation lasting 10 seconds, each exhalation carrying a slight vocalization that approximated syllables without forming words. The sound came from uptrail, deeper into the wilderness, moving closer with the unhurried patience of an apex predator, approaching prey that had nowhere left to run. Ashley's training said stand ground, make noise, appear large, standard protocol for predator encounters. But every instinct older than civilization screamed, run, hide, pray that whatever was making that sound hadn't noticed her yet. She ran. Not the measured retreat she'd learned in tactical training, but pure flight response, higher brain functions surrendering to limbic system imperatives that predated language. Her boots pounded the hidden lake trail, camera equipment bouncing against her chest, radio and GPS forgotten in the immediate necessity of creating distance between herself and the breathing sound. The forest blurred past. Ashley registered landmarks without processing them. Bear Hat Mountain to the northeast, Reynolds Peak south, the trail climbing toward Continental Divide at Logan Pass. She'd covered this terrain hundreds of times, knew every switchback and elevation change, could navigate it blindfolded. But the trail was changing. Subtle alterations at first, a boulder that seemed slightly out of position, a tree that leaned at an unfamiliar angle. Then more obvious distortions, the trail forking where no fork existed on any map, cairns marking paths that led into dense undergrowth rather than established routes. The forest was reorganizing itself around her, reality becoming malleable, geography refusing to obey consistent rules. Ashley forced herself to stop, pressed her back against a white bark pine, fought to regulate her breathing. Panic solved nothing. She needed to think, to analyze, to find the rational explanation that must exist beneath the impossible surface details. The breathing sound had stopped. Either she'd successfully escaped its range, or it had stopped pursuing because pursuit was unnecessary. Because prey that ran blindly into unfamiliar territory without navigation tools or communication would eventually trap itself without predator intervention. Ashley checked her GPS. The device showed her position as 48.7012 degree in 113.7401 degree W, coordinates that placed her approximately 3 miles northwest of where she'd started running. 3 miles in maybe 15 minutes, impossible at this elevation with full gear, requiring sustained sprint speed no human could maintain. Yet here she stood, breathing hard but not collapsed, muscles aching but functional, at a location her GPS insisted was real despite the journey making no physical sense. She tried her radio again. Rodriguez to any station, emergency traffic, requesting immediate assistance. Static answered. This is Ranger Ashley Rodriguez, badge number 7734, requesting evac from coordinates 48.7012, 130.7401. I've found evidence related to the Dakota Martinez disappearance and need backup immediately. The static resolved into words. but not Sarah Whitmore's voice from base station. This voice was male, young, terrified. "Ashley, oh God, Ashley, is that you? I can hear you, but I don't know where I am, and I'm so hungry and I can't stop thinking about eating, and there's something wrong with me. Something really wrong. I can feel it changing me from inside and..." "Dakota Martinez?" Ashley gripped the radio. "Dakota, where are you? Can you see any landmarks?" "I don't. Everything looks the same. All trees and rocks, and I've been walking for hours, but I keep ending up in the same place, and the hunger... God, the hunger won't stop, and I ate something, I don't remember what, but I remember the taste, and now I want more, and I can't..." The voice cracked into sobbing. "Don't come looking for me. Whatever's happening, it's contagious somehow. I felt it in the cold first, then the hunger. And now I'm changing, and if you find me, I don't know if I'll be able to stop myself from..." The transmission ended with a sound Ashley would hear in nightmares for the rest of her life. Crunching, wet and organic, like teeth breaking through bone, followed by a moan that combined agony with something worse: satisfaction. She dropped the radio, backed away from it as though the device itself was contaminated. Her scientific training insisted radio transmissions couldn't carry infection. That psychological distress from isolation was making Martinez delusional. But the evidence kept accumulating against scientific explanations, kept suggesting that maybe, possibly, the Blackfeet elders hadn't been speaking metaphorically about spirits that consumed from within and transformed humans into something hungry. Ashley needed high ground, needed to establish visual reference points, needed to regain navigational orientation before the forest's impossible geometry trapped her completely. She climbed, pushing through lodgepole pine understory, scrambling up granite slopes that shredded her palms but offered vertical progress away from the valley floor, where something breathed and hunted. She emerged above treeline 15 minutes later, gasping in thin air at what her altimeter claimed was 8,400 feet elevation. The Continental Divide stretched before her, peaks marching north into Canada, the spine of North America dividing watersheds that flowed to different oceans. Familiar territory, landscape she'd studied and photographed and loved for 6 years. Except the peaks were wrong. Not obviously wrong. The general shapes remained familiar, Bearhat and Reynolds and Clement still recognizable. But proportions had shifted. Distances refused to match her memory. Entire mountains seemed to have migrated several degrees east or west of their proper positions. Ashley pulled out her personal camera, a Canon EOS 5D Mark II she used for off-duty photography, and compared the current landscape to photos from her archives. She'd shot this exact view from this exact position 18 months ago during a personal climbing trip. The images should match perfectly. They didn't. In her archive photo, Reynolds Peak stood distinct against the skyline, separated from its neighbors by clear gaps. In current reality, Reynolds Peak had merged with Kootenai Peak, the gap between them filled with stone that shouldn't exist according to millions of years of geological formation. The landscape was literally rewriting itself while she watched. Ashley felt something inside her mind begin to fracture, not dramatically, not with accompanying horror movie soundtrack, but quietly, inevitably, like ice developing hairline cracks before catastrophic failure. She'd built her identity on understanding reality through empirical observation, on the principle that careful measurement revealed truth regardless of preconceptions. But what did you do when careful measurement confirmed the impossible? When empirical observation documented reality's refusal to obey consistent rules? When your training and education became obstacles rather than tools, because they insisted you reject evidence your senses confirmed? She'd lost Dakota Martinez. That realization settled with brutal finality. Not, haven't found yet or still searching. Actually lost, maybe to death, maybe to transformation into whatever that radio transmission had suggested Martinez was becoming. And she might lose herself too if she couldn't integrate what she was experiencing into a functional framework for decision-making. Ashley sat on granite still warm from afternoon sun and forced herself to think like an anthropologist rather than a hard scientist. The Blackfeet elders had described the Wendigo not as supernatural entity, but as real danger with specific characteristics, behaviors, vulnerabilities. If she stopped resisting the framework and instead treated it as field guide to an unknown species, what did the information suggest? Wendigo manifested through extreme hunger, particularly hunger that violated cannibalism taboos. It consumed everything: flesh, spirit, warmth, leaving emptiness. It could transform humans who encountered it or engaged in forbidden eating. It distorted space and perception, made navigation impossible, isolated victims from help. Vulnerabilities: fire, communal resistance, acknowledgement of the condition before transformation completed. That last detail caught Ashley's attention. The legends emphasized naming the Wendigo, speaking its nature aloud, refusing to let it exist in denial and secrecy, as though the entity drew power from being ignored, from victims insisting everything was explainable and fine even as reality contradicted those insistences, like she'd been doing since finding the elk. Ashley stood, cupped hands around her mouth, and shouted into the distorted wilderness, "I acknowledge you. I see what you are. Wendigo, Wedico, Wetico, whatever name you recognize, I'm not denying your existence anymore." The silence that followed felt different from the oppressive quiet surrounding the elk carcass. This silence was expectant, attentive, as though something had been waiting for exactly this admission. Then the forest exhaled. Not metaphorically. Actually, exhaled. Ashley felt the wind on her face, warm and humid despite alpine elevation, carrying the smell of decay and wrongness. The exhalation came from everywhere simultaneously, from the trees and rocks and earth itself, as though the landscape was a living organism acknowledging her acknowledgement. The peaks stopped shifting. The geometry stabilized. Ashley's GPS suddenly showed coordinates that matched her visual reference points, the numbers snapping into proper relationship with observable reality. But the breathing sound returned, closer now, maybe 50 yards downslope, moving with the methodical pace of something that knew pursuit was unnecessary because the prey had nowhere left to flee. Ashley started moving northeast, toward Logan Pass, toward Ranger Station and back up in civilization. She didn't run. Running had accomplished nothing except exhaustion and disorientation. Instead, she maintained steady hiking pace, conserving energy, keeping visual contact with landmarks that finally stayed put when she looked away. She found Dakota Martinez at dusk, or what remained of Dakota Martinez, crouched in a hollow beneath an overhanging ledge, consuming something Ashley refused to identify too closely. The figure still wore Martinez's clothing, Arc'teryx shell, outdoor research pants, but the proportions were wrong, elongated, limbs too long and joints bending at angles human anatomy didn't permit. The figure's head turned toward Ashley, and in the fading light she saw eyes that reflected like a predator's tapetum lucidum, pupils huge and black, surrounding them with only minimal sclera visible. Ranger Rodriguez. The voice was Martinez's voice, mostly, stretched thin over something else. "You shouldn't have come. I told you not to come. I'm still hungry and you're alone, and I don't think I can stop myself much longer." Ashley kept 20 yards distance, positioned herself where she could retreat if necessary. "Dakota, listen to me. What's happening isn't your fault. You encountered something and it's changing you, but transformation isn't complete yet. The legends say there's a window, a period where acknowledgement can stop the progression." "What legends?" Martinez laughed, the sound bubbling with madness. "This isn't a legend. This is me being so hungry I can't think about anything except eating. And I already ate something I shouldn't have. Something that made me want more. And now I can feel myself becoming something that will never stop being hungry." "Wendigo," Ashley said clearly. "That's what the Blackfeet call it. Algonquian cultures across the northern forests have different names but same concept. Spirit of endless consumption. Transformation through violating sacred prohibitions. It's real. You encountered it. But you're still you enough to be talking to me, which means the process isn't irreversible yet." Martinez stood, unfolding to a height that shouldn't fit under the 6-foot ledge clearance. "How do I stop it?" "Fire. Community. Acknowledgement." Ashley rattled off what she remembered from training. "The Wendigo can't maintain form when exposed to fire or surrounded by people who name it and refuse to deny its existence. But you have to come with me, have to return to the ranger station where—" "I can't." Martinez shook their distorted head. "I'll try to eat someone. I can feel it. The closer I get to people, the stronger the hunger becomes. It's not regular hunger, Ashley. It's not physical need, it's metaphysical starvation. Like I'm empty in ways that go deeper than my body, and the only thing that temporarily fills the void is consumption. Ashley thought about the elk, hollow from within. Thought about the cold that surrounded feeding sites, as though the Wendigo consumed heat itself as well as physical matter. Thought about how she'd spent the last 6 years training her mind to reject supernatural explanations, even when evidence contradicted material assumptions. Then we do it here, she said. We build a fire. I call for backup. We surround you with witnesses who acknowledge what you are without denying your humanity. The legends say that works too. Community recognition preventing full transformation. And if it doesn't work? Martinez asked quietly. Then I have bear spray, emergency flares, and 6 years of wilderness survival training. Ashley unclipped her equipment, began gathering deadfall. But I'm not leaving you to become something that hunts other hikers. That's not how search and rescue works. She built the fire methodically, using ferro rod and natural tinder, creating a sustainable burn rather than flashy flames. The fire seemed to stabilize Martinez, who retreated to the hollow's far edge, watching the flames with expression caught between hunger and relief. Ashley tried her radio. This time, miraculously, base station answered. Rodriguez, where the hell have you been? We've had teams searching for you for 3 hours. 3 hours. She'd been gone 8 by her watch, but time apparently followed its own rules in Wendigo territory. Found Martinez, Ashley reported. Coordinates 48.7081, 113.7234. Situation is complicated. I need evacuation team, medical support, and someone from Blackfeet Cultural Liaison Office immediately. Is Martinez injured? Ashley looked at the elongated figure crouching in shadows, eyes reflecting firelight. Yes, but not in ways your standard protocols address. Just trust me and bring everyone I requested, and bring more fire, road flares, fuel, anything that burns. She kept the fire burning through the night, adding wood methodically, maintaining the boundary between Martinez and the transformation that wanted to complete itself. They talked sporadically, Martinez describing the cold that had crept through their chest, the hunger that had started as normal appetite and metastasized into existential emptiness, the moment they'd crossed whatever boundary separated human from other. I ate a rabbit, Martinez confessed as dawn approached. Found it dead already, probably killed by an eagle, and I was so hungry, and it seemed fine, seemed harmless. But it was wrong somehow, tainted. And after I ate it, the hunger got worse instead of better. Like I'd opened a door that shouldn't be opened. Ashley thought about taboos, about how every culture developed prohibitions around death and consumption and boundary crossing. Maybe those prohibitions weren't arbitrary superstition, but practical wisdom encoded across generations. Warning systems that said, here there be monsters if you violate these specific rules. The rescue team arrived at 6:40 hours. Paramedics, rangers, and critically, an elderly Blackfeet woman named Mary Talks to Sky who listened to Ashley's explanation without skepticism or dismissal. Witikow, Mary confirmed, looking at Martinez with sad recognition. Haven't seen this in 20 years, but it happens sometimes when people forget why the old rules exist. The rabbit was placed as bait, and you took it, and now the spirit has hold of you. Can it be stopped? Martinez asked desperately. Yes, but it's not comfortable. Mary began pulling items from her bag. Sweetgrass, sage, something that might have been tobacco. You have to starve it. Completely. No food until the hunger breaks and releases you. Usually 3 days if the transformation is caught early. 3 days. Ashley watched Martinez's gaunt face, saw the desperation there, the knowledge that 3 days of absolute starvation while something consumed you from inside would be torture. But Martinez nodded. Do it. Whatever it takes. I don't want to become something that hunts people. They evacuated Martinez by helicopter, transferred to a secure medical facility where the official explanation was severe hypothermia with psychological complications. Mary Talks to Sky went along, conducting ceremonies that hospital staff tolerated with uncomfortable politeness. Ashley filed her report, knowing it would be heavily edited before entering official records. The true account, Wendigo transformation prevented through traditional knowledge that her scientific training had almost caused her to reject, would remain in classified files where it couldn't challenge institutional assumptions about reality's nature. Dakota Martinez recovered after 4 days, the hunger breaking as Mary had predicted. Transformation reversing once feeding stopped long enough to starve the spirit rather than the body. The official explanation remained hypothermia and temporary psychosis. Everyone pretended to believe it. Ashley returned to duty after 3 days mandatory leave. She resumed patrols, resumed search and rescue, resumed her work protecting visitors from the wilderness's natural dangers. But she walked differently through the forest now, more carefully, more respectfully, with awareness that her scientific education explained most phenomena most of the time, but not all phenomena all the time. That indigenous knowledge wasn't quaint folklore but functional field guide to dangers her culture had deliberately forgotten. She carried traditional offerings now, tobacco, sage, and left them at certain sites where the forest felt different, where the boundaries between ordinary and extraordinary wore thin. The other rangers noticed but didn't comment, and Ashley didn't explain. Some lessons couldn't be taught through academic training. Some truth required direct experience, required confrontation with impossibility, required the humility to acknowledge that your worldview might have gaps where ancient wisdom still applied. She never found the hollow elk carcass when she returned to document it. The site showed no evidence of disturbed remains, no temperature inversions, nothing but ordinary forest doing ordinary forest things. But Ashley knew what she'd seen, knew what Dakota Martinez had almost become, knew that scientific skepticism, taken too far, became its own form of dangerous ignorance. And sometimes, on quiet patrols when the forest went too silent and the temperature dropped without meteorological cause, Ashley heard breathing in the distance. Slow, patient, hungry. She acknowledged it, named it, refused to pretend everything was explainable through materialist frameworks, and the breathing always retreated, having heard the only thing it really wanted, someone willing to admit it was real. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Matthew Davidson found Justin Taylor's journal on a trail that didn't exist on any map, a trail that led in 5 different directions simultaneously, depending on which eye he closed. He'd been a ranger at Olympic National Park for 8 years, long enough to know every documented path through the Enchanted Valley, long enough to have memorized the elevation changes, the creek crossings, the places where the trail forked and rejoined. This wasn't one of them. This trail appeared between 2 lodgepole pines that Matthew had photographed just 3 months ago for a park survey. Trees that had stood exactly 18 inches apart, too narrow for any passage. Now they framed an opening wide enough to walk through, and beyond them stretched a path worn smooth by what looked like decades of foot traffic. The journal lay in the exact center of the trail, spine up, pages fluttering in wind that Matthew couldn't feel on his own skin. He checked his Garmin eTrex 30. The coordinates placed him at 47.8234 degree N, 123.4521 degree in W, precisely where he should be according to his search grid. The elevation read 2,847 feet. Everything normal. Everything exactly as it should be, except for the impossible trail and the journal that had Justin Taylor's name embossed in fading gold on the leather cover. Matthew had a degree in forestry from Washington State University and a minor in geology. He believed in soil composition, watershed dynamics, and the predictable behavior of ecosystems under stress. He did not believe in trails that appeared overnight, or in the local stories about the Enchanted Valley, stories of hikers who claimed the forest rearranged itself, of shadows that moved wrong, of spaces between trees that led somewhere other than deeper woods. He photographed the trail with his iPhone 5s before approaching the journal. The camera's timestamp read 2:47 p.m., October 23, 2014. Justin Taylor had been reported missing 4 days ago by his girlfriend after he failed to return from what was supposed to be a solo weekend hike. His car was still at the Graves Creek trailhead, registration current, nothing obviously disturbed. His emergency contact information listed him as 26 years old, employed as a software engineer at Amazon in Seattle, experienced hiker with no history of mental health issues or risky behavior. The search grid had been methodical. Matthew had been working the eastern quadrant, the section closest to the Quinault River where most lost hikers eventually ended up, following water downstream in confused attempts at self-rescue. He hadn't expected to find anything this far from the primary search area, hadn't expected to find this. The journal's pages were dry despite yesterday's rain, despite the moisture that hung perpetually in Olympic's temperate rainforest. Matthew picked it up with gloved hands, protocol for potential evidence, and opened to the first entry. September 30th, 2014. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical. Day 1. Weather clear. Made camp at mile marker 7. Saw my first one today. Thought it was another hiker at first, but it didn't move right. Stood too still. Watched me from the tree line for 3 hours. When I looked at it directly, it wasn't there. When I looked away, I could see it in my peripheral vision. Perfectly human-shaped, but made of something darker than shadow. Something that absorbed light instead of just blocking it. Matthew's rational mind immediately cataloged explanations. Sleep deprivation, dehydration, the human brain's tendency to create patterns, to see faces and figures in random arrangements of light and dark. He flipped forward, scanning entries. October 2nd. They're following me. Counted 7 distinct ones today. They never come closer than 30 feet, but they're always there just at the edge of where I can't quite see them clearly. Started marking trees to make sure I'm not walking in circles. The marks keep disappearing. October 5th. Found another hiker's pack. Old. Maybe from the 80s based on the style. Name tag said Robert Morrison. Looked him up on my phone before the battery died. Missing since 1987. Last seen on the Enchanted Valley Trail. They found his campsite but never found him. I think I know why. I think he's still here. I think they all are. October 8th. The trail is changing. I've been hiking for 8 days, but I'm still in the Enchanted Valley. Should have reached the ranger station days ago. Every time I check my map, the landmarks are in different places. The river runs uphill for 3 miles, then falls in a waterfall that shouldn't exist. My compass spins. My GPS shows my location jumping randomly. Sometimes I'm in Washington, sometimes Alaska, sometimes nowhere that has coordinates. Last night I heard voices. Not the shadow people, they don't make sound, but other voices, human voices, screaming. The final entry was dated October 18th, 5 days ago. The handwriting had deteriorated into barely legible scrawl. They're not shadows, they're gaps, places where reality stops. I understand now. This isn't the forest. This is what's underneath. This is what's always been underneath. The trails we follow are just skin stretched over something vast and hollow. I can see the tears now. See where the skin is thin. They're widening. I think they want me to come through. I think I'm going to. I think I have to. Maybe on the other side, directions make sense again. Matthew closed the journal and looked up. The impossible trail was gone. He stood between 2 lodgepole pines exactly 18 inches apart, no room for passage, just the regular forest continuing in all directions. His Garmin still read the same coordinates. The timestamp on his phone confirmed only 3 minutes had passed since he'd photographed the trail. 3 minutes during which he'd read 9 journal entries spanning 18 days. He keyed his Motorola radio. Davidson to base. I found evidence related to the Taylor search. Requesting additional units at my coordinates. Static answered. Not the normal radio static of interference, but something that sounded almost like breathing. Deep and slow and coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Matthew adjusted the frequency. Tried again. Same result. He checked his phone. No service, which was normal for this elevation. But the signal bars were doing something abnormal, flickering between 0 and full and displaying numbers that didn't match any carrier standard. A shadow moved at the corner of his vision. Matthew turned his head quickly. the rational part of his brain cataloging what he saw. Nothing. Just trees and undergrowth and the normal play of light through canopy. But when he looked away, focused on his radio, the shadow was there again in his peripheral awareness, human-shaped, standing 15 feet away, perfectly still in a way that nothing alive should be still, with an absolute motionlessness that violated the micro-movements of breathing, of heartbeat, of blood flow. He forced himself to stare directly at the spot. Empty forest. He looked away. The shadow was closer now. 10 feet, still at the edge of his peripheral vision, still impossible to see when he looked directly at it. Matthew's heartbeat accelerated despite his conscious attempts to control it. Adrenaline dumped into his bloodstream, triggering fight-or-flight responses that his prefrontal cortex tried to override with rational analysis. This was a trick of perception, an artifact of the brain's visual processing system, which constructed reality from incomplete data and filled gaps with expectation. The journal had primed him to see what Justin Taylor had seen. Suggestion was powerful. Stress created hallucination. But the shadow moved again when Matthew turned to retrieve his pack, moved with impossible speed to stand directly behind where his head had been, close enough now that he could see, or thought he could see, the way light bent around it. Not blocked or reflected, but actively consumed, pulled inward toward some center that wasn't quite located in three-dimensional space. Matthew walked, kept his eyes forward, navigated by memory and the trail markers he knew were real. His GPS guided him back toward base camp, the coordinates updating normally now. He didn't look at his peripheral vision, refused to acknowledge what might or might not be following. By the time he reached the ranger station 2 hours later, the sun had dropped behind the Olympic Mountains, and the forest had filled with the thick gray twilight that preceded full darkness. 3 other rangers were gathered around the communications desk, all of them looking at the same thing Matthew had been avoiding thinking about for the past hour. The wall map showing the search grid. Ranger Lisa Hoffman spoke first. "We have a problem." She was 53, had worked Olympic for 2 decades, carried herself with the competence of someone who'd performed thousands of rescues. Her hand shook slightly as she pointed to the map. 6 hikers reported missing from this valley since 1982, all experienced, all carried proper equipment. 5 were never found. The 6th walked out of the forest 3 weeks after he disappeared, 60 miles from where he went in, with no memory of the time between. "Robert Morrison," Matthew said, and saw Lisa's eyes sharpen. "You found something." Matthew placed Justin Taylor's journal on the desk. "Read the October 5th entry." While Lisa read, Matthew pulled up the park's historical records on the computer. The search was easier than it should have been. Someone had already compiled a file titled Enchanted Valley Disappearances, last modified 3 months ago by a user account belonging to Ranger Thomas Webb, who'd retired in June after 30 years of service. Matthew had met him twice, remembered him as gruff and dismissive of what he called tourist superstition. The file was extensive, 47 pages of incident reports, witness statements, and Webb's personal notes. The earliest case dated to 1952, a geological surveyor named Patricia Henderson, who'd been mapping the valley. Her equipment was found, including her field notebooks, showing increasingly erratic data, elevation measurements that didn't match topographic surveys, compass readings pointing to multiple norths, sketches of landmarks that didn't exist. The last entry read, "The shadows are moving wrong. They're not following the light source. They're moving toward me." 1967. 3 hikers disappeared together. Their campsite was found intact, meals still warm in bowls, all gear accounted for. No signs of struggle or animal activity. One tent had a journal inside describing figures made of absence that stood in places where space seemed to fold in on itself. 1982. Robert Morrison, the name from Justin Taylor's journal. Official report stated he walked out of the forest disoriented and dehydrated, but physically unharmed. Webb's personal notes included a different story, an off-the-record interview where Morrison claimed he'd spent 3 weeks in between, his phrase, walking through forests that didn't follow normal geometry, where the same landmarks appeared at different elevations, where day and night cycled irregularly, sometimes lasting hours, sometimes minutes, where shadows moved independently of their casting objects. 1994, a park ranger named David Chen. His body was eventually found, officially attributed to a fall. Webb's notes questioned this. Chen was experienced climber. Fall location doesn't match injury pattern. Skin showed unusual discoloration, patches of extreme pallor as if light had been pulled out of tissue itself. Autopsy noted abnormally low vitamin D levels despite sun exposure. Request for further investigation denied. The pattern continued. Every 7 to 9 years, always in the Enchanted Valley, always experienced hikers or rangers who understood the wilderness, never groups larger than 3. Victims reported the same phenomena: reality inconsistency, shadow figures, trails that led nowhere or everywhere, the sense of space folding in wrong dimensions. Webb's final note was dated June 15, 2014, his last day. They're not hallucinations. I've seen them myself over the years. Never told anyone because they'd pull my certification, but they're real, or there's something real wearing the shape of unreal. I think they're gaps in what exists, places where existence thins out. The forest here is old, older than the mountains themselves. Something lived here before geology, before physics stabilized. Something that existed when reality was still flexible. It's still here, in the spaces between trees, in the moments between heartbeats. It's patient. It's hungry. It doesn't want to harm. It wants to absorb, to add to itself. Every person it takes becomes part of the absence. They warned me when I was new, the Quinault elders. They have stories about the hollow places, about people who walk into the forest and become part of the nothing. I didn't believe them. I believe them now. I'm retiring before it decides I've been here too long. Matthew looked up from the computer to find all 3 rangers watching him. Lisa spoke quietly. Tom showed me that file before he left. Told me to read it if anyone else went missing here. I thought he'd lost it. 30 years in the woods, you see things. Brain makes up stories. I thought that's what it was. But, Matthew prompted, but yesterday while we were setting up the search grid, I saw something at the edge of the tree line. Just for a second, in my peripheral vision. Human-shaped, but wrong. Made of something that wasn't quite darkness. Thought I was tired seeing things. Then Chen's daughter called this morning. Lisa's jaw tightened. She's been researching her father's death. Has questions about the autopsy. Wants to know why no one investigated the witness statements from other rangers who claimed they saw shadow figures near where her father died. The radio crackled. All 4 rangers turned to stare at it. Through the static came a voice, thin, distant, fractured, as if traveling through layers of interference. Davidson, can you help me? The trail keeps, they're everywhere, can't tell which, real. Matthew grabbed the handset. Justin Taylor, if you can hear me, stay where you are. Mark your location and stay put. Tried, but markers disappear, think I'm underneath, can see the tears. Reality is so thin here, you have to, before they... The transmission cut to static that resolved into something almost like words, syllables that didn't match any language Matthew knew, speaking in rhythms that made his inner ear ache and his vision distort at the edges. He switched off the radio. The silence felt almost worse than the sound. We need to pull the search, Lisa said. Scrub it completely. Tell the girlfriend we found no evidence, close the case, wait for him to walk out like Morrison did. If he walks out, another ranger added. Morrison was lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you look at it. Matthew's scientific mind rebelled against the implication. People didn't just disappear into nothing. Reality didn't have gaps. The universe operated on consistent physical laws that didn't bend or break regardless of location or local folklore. But he'd seen the shadow, had felt the wrongness of its movement, had read 30 years of consistent testimony from reliable witnesses describing the same impossible phenomena. I'm going back out, he said. Matthew, with proper equipment, real-time GPS logging, multiple cameras including thermal imaging, everything documenting simultaneously. If there's a rational explanation, I'll find it. If there isn't, He stopped, didn't finish the sentence because finishing it required accepting premises his education had trained him to reject. Lisa was quiet for a long moment. Finally, Tom left something else, said to give it to anyone who went looking. She retrieved a small leather pouch from her desk drawer. Inside was a collection of objects: salt in a sealed container, a bundle of dried herbs Matthew recognized as sage, a piece of obsidian carved with symbols he didn't recognize, and a handwritten note. The note read, "The Kinno call them stolen spaces, places where the world forgot to be. They say salt marks boundaries the stolen spaces can't cross. Sage smoke makes them visible, or makes the edges visible anyway. Obsidian holds old magic, reflects what shouldn't be reflected. Don't know if any of it works. Don't know if anything works. But if you're reading this, you're going in anyway. So take it. And Matthew, if you're the one reading this, I'm not surprised. You're like me. You need to understand, that need will kill you if you're not careful. Or it will make you see things you can't unsee. Same thing, maybe." Matthew pocketed the pouch. "I need to prep. Leaving at first light." He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he spread the contents of Justin Taylor's journal across his bunk, photographing each page, analyzing the progression of entries. The handwriting deteriorated not just in neatness but in fundamental consistency. Letters that changed size mid-word, lines that curved impossibly around the page margins, a final entry whose text seemed to shift slightly every time Matthew looked away and back again, as if the words themselves couldn't decide what they wanted to say. At 3 a.m., Matthew opened the park's personnel files and cross-referenced names with the disappearance cases, found connections that made his hands cold. Patricia Henderson, the 1952 surveyor, had been Thomas Webb's grandmother. The name had been buried in files because she'd married and changed it. Webb had grown up hearing stories about his grandmother who'd walked into Olympic and never came out, who'd left notebooks filled with impossible data that the family kept in an attic somewhere, treated as evidence of mental decline rather than accurate observation. David Chen's incident report included a detail that hadn't been in Webb's notes. 3 days before his death, Chen had reported equipment malfunctions, compass failures, GPS showing him in impossible locations, once placing him in Seattle while he was demonstrably standing at 4,000 feet elevation in the park. He'd attributed it to magnetic anomalies. The report had been dismissed as equipment failure. Every disappearance followed the same pattern: initial contact with shadow phenomena, then equipment malfunctions, then the victim walking into areas where reality seemed unstable, finally vanishing into spaces that shouldn't exist. Matthew's scientific training screamed against the implications, but his pattern recognition couldn't ignore them. This wasn't random. This was systematic. Something in the Enchanted Valley was hunting. Had been hunting for decades, using a method that left almost no evidence because it removed people from causality itself. Dawn came gray and thick with mist. Matthew loaded his pack with standard search equipment plus additions. 3 smartphones with different GPS software, a GoPro camera set to continuous recording, a thermal imaging scope borrowed from the Wildlife Observation Program, Webb's leather pouch, and a laminated print of the 1890 Geological Survey map showing the valley before modern trails were established. The early geology was interesting. The Enchanted Valley sat in a formation where 3 separate tectonic events had created a junction of rock types that normally wouldn't be adjacent: ancient seafloor, volcanic intrusion, and glacial deposit. The angles didn't match standard geological models. Whoever had surveyed it had noted spatial anomalies suggesting errors in measurement equipment and recommended additional study that apparently never happened. Matthew hiked alone, following the search grid to the coordinates where he'd found Justin's journal. The forest was quiet. Wrong kind of quiet. Birds should have been active at dawn, but he heard nothing except his own footsteps and breathing. The mist clung lower than it should, pooling in valleys and between trees, never dispersing despite the morning thermals that should have lifted it. He reached the 2 lodgepole pines at 7:23 a.m. according to his GPS log. They stood 18 inches apart. As he watched, the gap between them widened. Not the trees moving. the space itself expanding like reality stretching to accommodate something that needed more room. Within 10 seconds, the gap was wide enough to walk through, and beyond it lay the trail that shouldn't exist. Matthew activated all his recording equipment and stepped through. The transition was immediate and visceral. Temperature dropped 15 degrees. The quality of light changed, becoming diffuse and directionless as if emanating from the air itself rather than the sky. His GPS immediately showed conflicting data. One phone placed him at his starting coordinates, another showed him 3 miles north, the third displayed coordinates that didn't exist, numbers too large for terrestrial latitude and longitude. The trail ahead looked worn and well-maintained, marked with cairns that showed decades of careful placement. But when Matthew checked his thermal scope, the cairn showed no heat signature. Not cold. Absent. No temperature at all, as if they existed in a space where thermodynamics didn't apply. He walked forward, each step feeling slightly off, as if gravity's pull came from a direction 5 degrees askew from down. The sensation made his inner ear protest, triggering mild nausea. His GoPro footage, when he checked it, showed normal forest. But when he pointed the thermal scope at the same view, the trees showed heat patterns that didn't match their visible structure. Warm patches where no sun penetrated, cold spots in direct light, and between some trunks, absolute black zones with no temperature reading at all. The shadow people appeared gradually. First one standing 30 feet ahead at a trail fork. When Matthew looked directly at it, he saw only empty trail. When he focused on his GPS while keeping the location in peripheral view, the figure was clearly visible. Human proportioned, 7 feet tall, made of something that bent light around itself, creating a perfect absence in the visual field. He tried the sage from Webb's pouch. The smoke curled normally at first, then twisted in directions that violated fluid dynamics, spiraling around invisible obstacles and defining boundaries Matthew couldn't see with unaugmented vision. Where the smoke touched, it revealed edges. Thin lines in space where the forest seemed to fold along seams. Reality origami creating spaces that shouldn't geometrically fit. Through the thermal scope, the edges glowed faint red, cooler than surroundings but not cold. And standing at those edges, dozens of shadow figures. They didn't move as he approached, didn't react, just stood in positions that suggested they were guarding the seams, or perhaps had become part of them, merged with the gaps they inhabited. Matthew marked the trail with chalk, drawing arrows and writing GPS coordinates at 20-meter intervals. When he looked back after walking 100 meters, the marks were gone. Not weathered or erased, gone as if they'd never been made. The trail behind him looked identical to the trail ahead, endless, unmarked, leading back and forward with equal plausibility. He checked his phone log. According to the timestamp, he'd been walking for 40 minutes. His watch showed the same, but his backup chronometer, a wind-up mechanical watch specifically chosen because it relied on springs and gears rather than electronics, showed 3 hours had passed. Time was broken here. Or time was functioning normally and space had changed, stretching or compressing to create apparent temporal discrepancies. A voice called from ahead. "Davidson, is that you?" Matthew recognized it. Justin Taylor, sounding close and clear despite no visible source. He moved forward, thermal scope raised, and found Justin sitting beside the trail, physically present, apparently unharmed, wearing the same clothes described in his missing persons report, but the thermal scope showed something wrong. Justin's body temperature was uniform, no variation between core and extremities, no heat differential between skin and clothing, no breath vapor despite the cold. Justin Taylor? Matthew kept his distance, hand on his radio despite knowing it wouldn't work here. "I think so. Hard to tell anymore. How long have I been here?" 4 days since you were reported missing. Your journal said 18 days. Justin laughed and the sound echoed wrong coming from multiple directions. 18 days, 4 days. Both wrong, both right. Time doesn't work the same once you're underneath. I've been here minutes and years. I've watched the trees grow and decay in cycles. I've seen the mountains rise and fall. Or maybe I've been here 10 minutes and my brain is breaking trying to process input it's not designed for. Matthew raised his phone, started recording video. The screen showed Justin clearly, but when Matthew looked at Justin directly, the man's edges seemed fuzzy, uncertain, as if he existed only probabilistically. "What is this place?" Matthew asked. "It's what's always been here. We just don't see it usually. The world is thinner here. The membrane between what exists and what doesn't. They live in the gaps." Justin gestured at the shadows. "They're not creatures. They're the absence of existence taking shape, places where reality forgot to be, forming into something that almost has agency. They don't mean harm. They just are. And when you spend too long near them, you become thin too. Probabilistic, uncertain. I'm going to get you out." Justin's expression was sad. "I don't think I can leave. I don't think I'm real enough anymore. Every day here I feel myself becoming less. Memories fade not because I forget, but because they stop having happened. My childhood is getting fuzzy. Not the memory of it, but the fact of it. I'm being erased backward through time. Soon I'll be like them. Just a shape that used to be someone, standing guard at the places where existence tears." Matthew's rational mind finally broke. Not shattered, but bent, reorganizing itself around new axioms. Reality was local. Physics was consensus. The universe ran on rules that could be violated in spaces where those rules had never been properly established. This valley was old, older than the mountains. It remembered or failed to remember a time before matter and energy had settled into stable patterns. "The journal," Matthew said. "Your final entry. You wrote that you understood, that you were going through. I went to see what was on the other side of the tears, found out there's no other side. Just more gap. Infinite absence. I'm standing in it now. So are you. We're having this conversation inside nothing, inside the space between spaces. When you leave, if you can leave, I'll still be here. Part of the static. Part of what doesn't exist." The shadow figures moved closer, not walking but appearing in new positions, their geometry allowing them to traverse distance without crossing the space between. They surrounded Matthew and Justin, dozens of them forming a circle that pulsed with non-existence. Matthew pulled out the obsidian from Webb's pouch, threw it. When he held it up and looked through its polished surface, he saw the truth. The valley wasn't a place. It was a wound. A gap in the fabric of reality where the universe had failed to completely form, leaving a pocket of protospace where existence remained uncertain. The shadow people were echoes of everyone who'd ever gotten lost here, probabilistic ghosts gradually losing coherence as their past dissolved. And he could see himself beginning to fade. His hands looked translucent when viewed through the obsidian, his own past becoming uncertain. If he stayed, he'd become like Justin, like all the others, standing guard at the edges of nothing until even the memory of having been someone dissolved completely. Matthew ran. Not back the way he'd come. That trail led nowhere now, but perpendicular to the logic that had brought him here. He ran across the fold lines he could see through the sage smoke, through the gaps the thermal scope showed as absolute zero, through the spaces where the shadow figures stood guard. Some tried to stop him, or maybe they tried to incorporate him, to add him to their chorus of absence. He felt their touch like cold fire, like the sensation of limbs falling asleep and waking up simultaneously, like the moment between existing and not. He broke through. The transition was violent. Gravity reasserted itself with full force, dropping him to his knees. Temperature surged back to normal. His ears popped as air pressure stabilized. All 3 GPS units on his phones locked onto the same coordinates: 47.8234 degree N, 123.4521 degree W, the same position where he'd entered. Matthew looked at his watch. 7:24 a.m. 1 minute had passed. His mechanical chronometer showed 2:13 p.m., 7 hours in a space that had lasted 1 minute. His GoPro had recorded nothing. The video jumped from him stepping between the pines to him stumbling back through with no frames captured in between. But his body knew. His muscles ached from hours of hiking. His water supply was depleted, and in his hand, he held something that hadn't been there before. A small object made of the same material as the shadow figures, solid absence given form. It was cold beyond any physical cold, pulling heat from his palm without itself warming. Behind him, the gap between the lodgepole pines narrowed to 18 inches. Through that gap, barely visible, Matthew saw Justin Taylor standing motionless among the shadow figures, watching, already becoming translucent, already forgetting he'd ever been real. Matthew radioed base. This time it worked. Davidson to station. No sign of Taylor. Recommend closing active search. I don't think we'll find him. The official report attributed Justin Taylor's disappearance to the same causes as others before him. Lost. Succumbed to elements. Body likely displaced by predation or water. Case closed pending discovery of remains. Matthew didn't write about what he'd actually found. Didn't mention the spaces between spaces or the shadow figures or Justin's transformation into uncertainty. Instead, he filed Thomas Webb's documentation under historical interest and archived the leather pouch in his personal locker. But he kept the object he'd brought back, the piece of solid absence. At night, he'd hold it and feel its impossible cold, and through it he could see himself becoming slightly translucent, his own existence growing uncertain. He'd spent too long in the gap. Part of him was still there, would always be there, standing at the edges with the others. Sometimes on patrol, Matthew saw figures at the edge of his vision, shadow-shaped, watching. He never looked directly at them, didn't need to. He understood now what they were. Not monsters or ghosts, but echoes of people who'd walked too close to where reality ended, who'd seen the tears in existence and couldn't unsee them. The Enchanted Valley continued to claim hikers. Once every 7 to 9 years, someone would walk into the forest and find the trails that led between. Matthew documented each case meticulously, adding to Webb's files, building a record that future rangers would find and struggle to believe until they too saw the shadows moving wrong. And late at night, when Matthew's reflection in the mirror looked too thin, too uncertain, he wondered if he was still in the forest. If this, the ranger station, his reports, his daily life, was just another fold in reality, another pocket of almost existence where he'd created a comfortable illusion, while his real body stood motionless at the edge of nothing, slowly dissolving backward through time. He'd hold the object of solid absence and remember Justin's words. I've been here minutes and years, and he'd wonder if minutes and years were the same thing when you existed between the moments, in the gaps where the universe forgot to completely form. The shadows watched from the tree line, patient, hungry in a way that had nothing to do with appetite, and everything to do with the fundamental drive of nothing to become something, of absence to fill itself with whatever wandered too close. Matthew watched back, and some nights when the moon was dark and the forest thick with mist, he thought about walking between those lodgepole pines again, about stepping through into the space that wasn't space, where Justin Taylor stood guard at tears in reality, where Patricia Henderson and David Chen and 40 others had become probability echoes, about finally understanding what Thomas Webb had meant. That need will kill you if you're not careful, or it will make you see things you can't unsee. Same thing, maybe. Matthew had seen, had understood. And understanding was its own kind of death, the death of certainty, of solid reality, of the comfortable belief that existence was consistent and whole. He was already becoming shadow, already becoming gap. The only question was how long until he stopped pretending otherwise. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened.